Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. On Tuesday, I described the way in which this government has taken a sledgehammer to our asylum system, and I outlined the massive and far-reaching costs and consequences of 13 years of Tory incompetence and indifference. I described this bigger backlog bill as a shambolic farce that will only compound the chaos that ministers have created. I urged the government to accept the amendments proposed by the other place and to adopt Labour's pragmatic, realistic and workable five-point plan to stop the boats and fix our broken asylum system. And I set out how the bill's unworkability centres on the fact that it orders the Home Secretary to detain asylum seekers where there is nowhere to detain them, because it prevents her from processing and returning failed asylum seekers who have crossed the Channel to their country of origin, instead forcing her to return them to a third country like Rwanda. And yet Rwanda can only take 0.3% of those who came here on a small boat last year. So the Rwanda plan is neither credible nor workable, because the tiny risk of being sent to Kigali will not deter those who have already risked life and limb to make dangerous journeys across the continent. But here we are again today, Madam Deputy Speaker, responding to the realisation that in their typically arrogant and tin-eared fashion, ministers are once again refusing to listen. They're once again closing their eyes and ears to the reality of what's happening around them and choosing to carry on driving the car straight into a brick wall. But we on these benches refuse to give up, Madam Deputy Speaker. We shall continue in our attempts to persuade the government to come to its senses. And I shall seek to do that today by setting out why the arguments that the Immigration Minister has made against the amendments that have come to us from the other place are both fundamentally flawed and dangerously counterproductive. Turning first, I will give way.
Gentlemen, for giving way. If the principle of removal to a safe third country is not an adequate deterrent, why was that principle the flagship of the last Labour government's immigration policy in the 2002 Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act? What was the point of Section 94, its most controversial provision, if it was not about swift removal of failed asylum seekers?
I thank her for her intervention. The crucial point here is that for a deterrent to be effective, it has to be credible. A deterrent that's based on 0.3% risk of being sent to Rwanda is completely and utterly incredible. The only deterrent that works is a returns deal with mainland Europe that is comprehensive. When you know that if you come here on a small boat, you will be sent back to mainland Europe, you will not come. You will not pay €5,000 to the people smuggler. Now, the only way to get that deal is to have a sensible and pragmatic negotiation with the European Union based on quid pro quo, give and take. That is the fundamental reality of the situation in which we find ourselves. But unfortunately, the benches opposite keep closing their ears to that reality.
Continue to press on. I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he not accept in reality that there's no such thing as a returns deal with mainland Europe? The reason why the Dublin Convention was such a disaster and never resulted in us removing more people than we took in, because it was so incredibly difficult to get European countries to accept removals and to make that happen. This is just a sort of unworkable suggestion.
Surely the Honourable Lady sees the direct connection between us crashing out of the Dublin regulation because of the utterly botched Brexit of the government that she speaks for, and as a result of that, small boat crossings started to skyrocket. There is a direct correlation between crashing out of the Dublin regulation and skyrocketing small boat crossings. I really do hope she'll look at the data and she will realise the truth of the matter.
To the honourable gentleman, because we've had this conversation before. He knows when we were covered by Dublin, before we came out through Brexit, there were over 8,000 requests for people to be deported back to an EU country. Only 108 of those, about 1.5, were actually granted. So there wasn't some golden era where it worked under Dublin. It wasn't working then, and it's certainly not going to work now.
Yes. He's right. We have had this conversation before, and he consistently refuses to listen to the fact that the Dublin regulation acted as a deterrent. So the numbers that he talks about were small, but the number of small boat crossings were small when we were in the Dublin regulation. We left the Dublin regulation. The numbers are now large. It's not rocket science. There is a clear connection, a correlation, a causal link between the two. So turning first, I will give him.
Extremely grateful. He's been very generous with his time. But isn't this not the point? The reason that the small boats problem has grown exponentially is that we dealt with the lorries issue.
Exactly.
We closed the loophole when it came to lorries and the Channel Tunnel in particular, and that is why people are now resorting to small boats. Nothing to do with Dublin.
Exactly.
Surely those are the facts.
Exactly.
Well, I simply say to the honourable and learned gentleman that if you take the numbers that were coming here illegally, of course, those coming in clandestine means in the back of a lorry, far more difficult to detect than those coming on a small boat. By definition, the small boats crisis is far more visible. But the reality is that last year we had 45,000 people coming on small boats, and goodness knows how many coming on lorries. It's true that the juxtaposition and the new arrangements did have a positive impact, but we still don't know how many are coming. I myself have been to camps in Calais and spoken to many who are planning to come on lorries, not on small boats, not least because it's a far cheaper alternative. So the reality is there is a very large number of people coming to our country through irregular means, but it is also clear that that number was significantly smaller when we were in the Dublin regulation, and that's because it was a comprehensive deterrent rather than the utterly insignificant power of the Rwanda programme as a deterrent. I'm going to make a little bit of progress, and then I'll allow the honourable gentleman. Turning first to Lord's Amendment 1B on ensuring this bill is consistent with international law, which we on these benches fully support. Last week, the Minister deemed this amendment unnecessary, and I quote, "because it goes without saying that the government obeys our international obligations, as we do with all pieces of legislation." This comment really was typical of the Minister's approach. He's constantly trying to calm his colleagues' nerves by fobbing them off with this sort of soothing statement. But we all know that he doesn't really believe a word of it himself. He knows that the very first page of this bill states that the government is unable to confirm that it complies with our legal obligations. And he also knows that the government is more than happy to break international law. Just look at how they placed fast and loose with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So if the Minister really thinks that we will simply take his deeply misleading words at face value and trust him and his colleagues to uphold our legal obligations, then he has another think coming.
Order. I think that the honourable gentleman didn't mean to use the phrase deeply misleading. I think perhaps, knowing that he is an honourable gentleman, that he might want to use a slightly different phrase. Inadvertently misleading, perhaps?
I thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would misleadingly soothing work as a...
It will do for the time being.
You are very gracious, as always, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the late, great Dennis Healey famously advised that when you're in a hole, you should stop digging. And he would certainly... hang on. And he would certainly have approved of Lord's Amendment 9B, which goes right to the heart of the fundamental unworkability of this bigger backlog bill and seeks to prevent it becoming the indefinite limbo bill. Because let's be clear, the current state of affairs represents both a mental health crisis for asylum seekers and a financial crisis for the British taxpayers, who are already shouldering an asylum bill which is 7 times higher than it was in 2010, at £3.6 billion a year. Indeed, the mid-range estimate for the hotels bill alone is even greater than the latest round of levelling up funding and 3 times higher than the entire budget for tackling homelessness in this country. Madam Deputy Speaker, the only people who benefit from the inadmissibility provisions in this bill are the people smugglers and the human traffickers who are laughing all the way to the bank. So it's essential that this House votes in favour of Lord German's amendment, which seeks to ensure that inadmissibility can only be applied to an asylum seeker for a period of 6 months if they have not been removed to another country. Madam Deputy Speaker, a major concern throughout the passage of this bill has been the utter disregard for the mental well-being of unaccompanied children, many of whom will have had to see their loved ones suffer unspeakable acts of violence. And yet, despite the government's concession, this legislation will mean that when they arrive in the UK, they'll be detained like criminals for up to 8 days before they can apply for bail. We are clear that this is unacceptable, and we're in no doubt that the government's amendment is yet another example of its liking for performative cruelty. We urge the Minister to accept the Lord's compromise of 72 hours under Lord's Amendment 36C and 36D. Sorry, I meant to let him in.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, but would the best thing for any person's mental health, especially children's mental health, is not to put them on a dangerous small boat across the Channel? It does not agree with the best thing for any child's mental health is they don't make that dangerous journey, use one of the many legal and safe routes. And this bill and these clauses actually make sure that fewer children make that awful journey.
It's absolutely right that the only people who benefit from the small boat crossings are the people smugglers and the human traffickers, and they have to be brought to an end. Where we fundamentally disagree is the means. We believe that the deterrence of the Rwanda scheme simply won't work for the reasons that I've already set out, and the solution lies far more in pragmatism and quiet diplomacy, working with international partners to get that returns deal that I talked about, rather than all the performative cruelty that we're seeing at the heart of this bill. Likewise, they should show some humility and support Lord's Amendment 33B, which states that accompanied children should only be liable for detention for up to 96 hours. This is a fair and reasonable compromise, given that initially Lord's Amendment 33 set the limit at 72 hours. And whilst we're on the subject of children, how utterly astonishing and deeply depressing it was to hear the Minister standing at that dispatch box last week and justifying the erasure of Disney cartoons on the basis of them being age appropriate. Quite apart from the fact that his nasty, bullying, performative cruelty will have absolutely no effect whatsoever in terms of stopping the boats, it's since emerged that more than 9,000 of the children who passed through that building in the year end to March 2023 were under the age of 14. Now, given that a significant proportion of that 9,000 would be younger still, I just wonder whether the Minister would like to take this opportunity to withdraw his comments about the age appropriateness of those cartoons. No. Well, there we have it, Madam Deputy Speaker. This whole sorry episode really was a new low for this Minister and for the shameful, callous government that he represents. Madam Deputy Speaker, we also support Lord's Amendment 23B, a compromise in lieu of Amendment 23, which seeks to protect LGBT asylum seekers from being removed to a country which persecutes them for their sexuality or gender. The Minister last week claimed that the clause was unnecessary because there's an appeals process. But why on earth would he put asylum seekers and the British taxpayer through an expensive and time-consuming appeals process when he could just rule out this scenario from the outset? Madam Deputy Speaker, nothing illustrates the indifference of this government towards the most vulnerable people in society more clearly than their treatment of women being trafficked into our country for prostitution. I've already described this bill as a trafficker's charter, a gift to the slave drivers and the pimps, because it makes it harder for victims to come forward and therefore more difficult for the police to prosecute criminals. The Immigration Minister last week repeated the false claim that the National Statistics Authority rebuked him recently for, his second rebuke this year by our National Statistics Watchdog for inaccurate claims made to this House. And thankfully, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead called him out on it. She's not in her place, but she correctly pointed out that the proportion of small boats migrants claiming to be victims of modern slavery stands at just 7%. This was a profoundly embarrassing moment for the Minister, but I do hope that he'll now swallow his pride, listen to the wise counsel that he's receiving from the benches behind him, and accept Amendment 56B in the name of Lord Randall.
Well, grateful to him for giving way, and he is right that I misspoke when quoting those statistics on an earlier occasion. But in fact, the statistics were worse than I said to the House. What I said was that of foreign national offenders who are in the detained estate on the eve of their departure, over 70% of them made use of modern slavery in order to put in a last-minute claim and delay their removal. It wasn't just FNOs. It was small boat arrivals. So the point I was making was even more pertinent, and one that he should try to answer what would he do to stop the 70% of people who are in the detained estate who are trying to get out of the country from putting in a frivolous claim at the last minute?
Well, the National Statistics Authority, Sir Robert Choate, said clearly that it's only 20%, not 70%. So, I mean, I don't know whether we want to maybe invite Sir Robert to clarify those points himself, but that's pretty clear from the rebuke that the Minister received from the NSA. Because it is vitally important that the Minister's position on this isn't being used as the basis for a policy which could cause profound harm to vulnerable women whilst feeding criminality within the United Kingdom. I therefore urge him to reflect on what he's trying to achieve, the proportionality of his actions, and the unintended consequences that he might be facilitating. Lord's Amendment 56B states that victims of trafficking who have been unlawfully exploited in the UK should be protected from the automatic duty to remove and should continue to be able to access the support currently available to them, but only for the duration of the statutory recovery period, which was set by the Nationality and Borders Act at 30 days. During our debate on second reading of this bill, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead argued that the bill as drafted would drive a coach and horses through the Modern Slavery Act, denying support to those who've been exploited and enslaved, and in doing so making it much harder to catch and stop the traffickers and the slave drivers. We strongly agree with her concerns and wholeheartedly support Amendment 56B, which I would remind the Minister goes no further than to maintain the status quo in terms of the basic protections and support currently available to all victims of trafficking and exploitation. Madam Deputy Speaker, I now turn to the amendments that are underpinned by Labour's 5-point plan to end the dangerous small boat crossings, defeat the criminal gangs, clear the backlog, end extortionate hotel use and fix the asylum system that the Conservatives have spent 13 years destroying. I will give way.
Very grateful. I mean, presumably it's the devoutest hope of the honourable gentleman in 15 months' time he takes power. But what's a bit of a mystery to me is, charming as he is, why does he think in 15 months' time, when he asks President Macron to take these people back, he will take them back? Of course he won't. Nothing will happen. So may I gently suggest to him that if there is a Labour government, they will quietly adopt this bill when it's an act?
Well, I'm coming on to that in my comments, but I will say to him that, as he will know, any negotiation requires give and take, quid pro quo. As I already said in response to one of his honourable friends, the point is that to get that deal with the European Union, we, of course, have to do our bit, take our fair share, and that will be the negotiation that my right honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, will be leading on when he becomes the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom following the next general election. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are determined that the National Crime Agency be strengthened so that it can tackle the criminal gangs upstream. Too much focus by this government has been on slashing tents and puncturing dinghies along the French coastline, whereas Labour has set out its plan for an elite unit in the NCA to work directly with Europol and Interpol. The latest amendment from Lord Coker, 106B, attempts to strengthen the NCA's authority, and we support it without reservation. We're also clear that there's a direct link between gaining the returns agreement we desperately need with the EU and creating controlled and managed pathways to asylum, which would allow genuine refugees to reach the UK safely, particularly if they have family here. The benches opposite refuse to make that connection, but we know that it is in the EU and France's interest to strike a returns deal with the UK to dissuade the tens of thousands of asylum seekers flowing through Europe and ending up on the beaches of Calais. But the EU, I will give way in 1 second, but the EU and its member states will of course never do a deal with the UK unless it's based on a give and take arrangement whereby every country involved does its bit and shares responsibility.
I thank the spokesperson for giving way. On his visit to Calais, he will have met people who were trying to get to this country. Did it strike him how utterly desperate many of them were and how they are fleeing from wars in Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq and other places? And does he not think there is a wider issue here that we've got to address about the very reasons why people are fleeing and searching for asylum, not just in Europe, but all over the world?
I thank my right honourable friend, and the key point, of course, as he rightly points out, is that these are people who already are fleeing desperate situations and have risked life and limb to get as far as where they've got to. So the idea that a 0.3% chance of being sent to Rwanda acts as a deterrent is clearly for the birds. But I know that in addition to that, he's making very important points about the need for international cooperation and for finding solutions to these problems alongside our partners across the Channel. But with the Minister... I will...
I thank the honourable gentleman. I thank the honourable gentleman. When he clearly thinks the Rwanda plan will not work and will not be a deterrent. So my question to the honourable member is, why not give it a go? If you're so confident it's not going to work, let it get through. It could have got through months ago, and then come back to the House and prove us wrong. But at the moment, to me, it comes across the honourable member and the Labour Party are scared that it might work, and that's the problem.
I suppose the answer to his question is that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. And the Rwanda plan is so clearly and utterly misconceived and misconstrued and counterproductive. We on these benches like to vote for things that are actually going to work, and that's why we simply can't support that harebrained scheme. But with the Minister last week reiterating a deadline of December 2024, 18 months' time from now, to lay out what safe and legal routes might look like, and by stating that these routes will not deal with the challenges facing Europe directly, he appears to be reducing the chances of getting the returns deal with the EU that we so urgently need. Let's not forget that this government sent Britain tumbling out of the Dublin regulation during their botched Brexit negotiations, and it's no surprise that small boat crossings have skyrocketed since then. This government must prioritise getting that returns deal. We therefore support Lord's Amendment 102B, which demands that the government get on with setting out what these safe and legal routes might look like, both to provide controlled and capped pathways to sanctuary for genuine refugees, but also to break that deadlock around negotiations with the EU over returns. Madam Deputy Speaker, I should also note that the Minister loves to trot out his lines about Ukraine, Hong Kong and Afghan resettlement schemes. He is, of course, neglecting to mention that there are now thousands of homeless Ukrainian families, and the travesty that thousands of loyal to Britain Afghans are set to be thrown onto the streets at the end of August. But also there are more than 2,000 Afghans stuck in Pakistan with a right to come here who aren't being allowed to. So he simply must fix those resettlement schemes. Yet he also... I will give way.
I'm grateful to give way, because it's an important point that all members of this House should appreciate. The number one reason why there are people in Pakistan who we would like to bring to the United Kingdom, because we have a moral and historical obligation to, but are struggling to do, is because illegal immigrants on small boats have taken all of the capacity of local authorities to house them. So if he truly wanted to support those people, he'd back this bill, he'd stop the boats, and then he would help us to bring those much-needed people into the United Kingdom.
It beggars belief that the Immigration Minister, who speaks for a party that has allowed our backlog to get to 180,000, costing £7 million a day in hotels, just get the processing system sorted out. The Conservatives downgraded the seniority of caseworkers and decision-makers in 2013-2014. Surprise, surprise, productivity fell off a cliff. The quality of the decisions fell off a cliff. That is the fundamental problem. But what we do have to recognise that these Afghans are people that have stood shoulder to shoulder with our defence, diplomacy and development effort in Afghanistan, and we owe them a debt of honour and gratitude.
Does the honourable gentleman know how many asylum seekers are housed in his constituency? Or would he like me to tell him? None. None. There are no asylum seekers accommodated in Aberavon. So if he would like us to bring in more people, whether on safe and legal routes or on schemes like ARAP, get on the phone to his local council and the Welsh Government this afternoon.
Well, he's talking absolute nonsense. I'm very proud of the fact that we have many Syrians in our constituency. We have Ukrainians in our welcome centre. The discussions have also been ongoing with the Home Office. I know that, and between the Home Office and the Welsh Government. If the incompetence of his government isn't managing to actually house it, Wales is absolutely ready to have that dialogue with the Home Office.
grateful to my honourable friend giving way. I find it quite a shocking admission from the Minister, the fact that we know and we are fighting for relatives of people in Afghanistan at this time whose lives are at risk, that they are being blocked by the Minister because he is not making available those safe routes to bring them into constituencies like in York, where we really do welcome refugees.
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and I do think that there are real concerns about the safety and security of those Afghans who are now in Pakistan. It's possible that they will be sent back. Of course, it's up to the Home Office to facilitate their transfer to the United Kingdom under ARAP and ACRS, but like so many things with this Home Office, it is just a catastrophic failure of management. Now, in trotting out the lines about the schemes that I mentioned, the Minister also conveniently ignores the fact that none of those schemes help those coming from other high grant rate countries in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And neither he nor the Home Secretary have been able to adequately answer that question from their own backbenchers on that precise point. Madam Deputy Speaker, the final point of our plan is to tackle migration flows close to the conflict zones where they arise through targeting our aid spending. This is a longer-term mission, but it is no less important than any of the other steps we need to take to meet these migration challenges. I therefore see no reason for the Government not to support Lord's Amendment 107B in the name of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which instructs the Government to develop a 10-year plan to manage migration. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've lost count of the number of times we've come to this chamber to debate the Government's latest madcap bill or harebrained scheme. But not one of these bills has helped to stop a single boat. And they've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than they have asylum seekers. They're wasting their own time, they're wasting the time of this House, and they really are trying the patience of the British people. It really is desperate stuff, and it has to stop. So in stark contrast to the hopeless, aimless and utterly self-defeating thrashing around that has come to define this Government's approach to the asylum crisis, we on these benches recognise that there is a way through this. It's a route based on hard graft, common sense and quiet diplomacy. It comes in the form of the Labour Party's comprehensive plan, based on core principles, a commitment to return asylum processing to the well-managed, efficient, smooth-running system we had prior to the catastrophic changes brought in by Conservative ministers in 2013, which downgraded decision-makers and caseworkers, resulting in poorer results. And with this, a commitment to go further in fast-tracking applications from low grant rate countries so we can return those with no right to be here, and in fast-tracking applications from high grant rate countries so that genuine refugees can get on with their lives and start contributing to our economy, enriching our society and culture. And a third key principle is the need for international cooperation, as I've already set out. It is not rocket science, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's just sensible, pragmatic, serious governance. And it's working in the United States. The Biden administration is winning the battle. They've introduced a combination of swift consequences for those who cross the border illegally, orderly paths and controls on who and where migrants get to apply for asylum, sensible legal pathways for high grant rate nations, and strong cooperation with Mexico. The result, they're bringing numbers down significantly and quickly. The challenge is not over yet, and you wouldn't see President Biden foolish enough to go boasting at the border. But it shows that progress can be made. The Labour Party is not interested in performative cruelty, chasing headlines or government by gimmick, Madam Deputy Speaker. But we do have a plan that will stop the boats, fix our broken asylum system and deliver for the British people. In contrast, the party opposite has run out of ideas and run out of road. It should get out of the way so that we can get to work. Thank you.
We have only